Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Tanya Hope and I'm going to be your chair for the panel discussion today. And we're going to be focusing on small schools and effective curriculum. My role is I'm Professor of Education at Plymouth Marjon University and also the BERA SIG convener for Education Effectiveness and Improvement. And it's this SIG that's hosting our panel discussion. Now, I've always had a special interest in rural, coastal and small schools, having lived and worked in rural and coastal areas as a teacher, education leader and researcher for over 30 years. Small schools are subject to the same curriculum and subject leadership requirements as all other schools. But as we know, equality doesn't mean equity. As the focus of policy is on larger schools with more staff and greater resources, this suggests that we need to think very carefully about the way small schools are supported. The panel members have a range of roles that focus on small schools, and they'll use their collective knowledge and expertise to explore how many schools or how small schools can develop an effective curriculum that meets their pupil needs and that of the regulatory bodies. Now, on that note, we have a range of panel members today, including our regulatory body, Ofsted. So I'm going to go through and say a few words to introduce our panel to you. And then I'm going to go over to them for them to identify an area related to small schools that they think is important to share with you today. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Amy Tinkler. Now, Amy Tinkler is well, actually, after being head of school and curriculum lead across a federation of four small schools in rural Derbyshire, Amy is now school improvement lead at the Diocese of Coventry MAT, a mixed multi-academy trust with a number of small and very small schools. She sits on the Ofsted Small Schools Reference Group, is writing a book about the challenges and opportunities faced by small schools, and that's to be published next year. Can't wait for that, Amy. And is currently president-elect of the Chartered College of Teaching. We also have Denise Bryant. Denise's current role involves overseeing local authority maintained small schools in Nottinghamshire and leading the small schools network across that county. In her role, she addresses areas such as curriculum, SEND, EDI, and Ofsted preparation. She's also collaborated with head teachers to develop leadership solutions for small schools and work with them on collaboration models. Dr. Kath Christie is also on our panel. Kath is a member of academic staff at the University of Plymouth. At the university, she teaches on undergraduate, master's and doctoral programmes. Her research is underpinned by a commitment to social justice, and she's interested in research that will make a difference to the lives of young people, their schools and the teachers. She has a particular interest in education in rural places, particularly in the UK, but also internationally. Her current research interests include small schools, multi-age classrooms, and access to schools. Kath is joined by Professor Morag Redford. Morag is the Associate Dean at the University of the Highlands and Islands, which has pioneered the provision of teacher education courses in the north and west of Scotland. Her research focuses on teacher education and the interface between research, policy and practice, with a particular interest in the relationship between rural schools and their communities. Today, she's going to be focusing on Scottish curriculum for small schools. Moving on to Andy Wolfe. So Andy is the Director of Education at the Church of England. He oversees the programmes, networks and research of the Church of England Foundation for Education Leadership, working with thousands of school leaders across the UK. The Church of England has many small schools, which are seen to be crucial as parts of their local communities. Lastly, but not leastly, we have our Ofsted HMI. Mike Sheridan. Mike first joined Ofsted as a seconded head teacher in 2007, and then went on to be appointed as one of Her Majesty's inspectors in 2009. Mike is a qualified teacher, and prior to being employed by Ofsted, he had several leadership roles. Most recently, he was the head teacher of a federation of schools. Mike took up the post as regional director in 2015, originally in London and now in the East. Lee Alston. Lee is a qualified teacher too, and holds postgraduate qualifications in educational leadership and management. Before joining Ofsted, he held a senior leadership position in school, well, actually in many schools, and local authorities and with national organisations. Lee is now one of His Majesty's Inspectorates and Deputy Director for Schools and Early Education. I wanted to get that right, Lee. Among Lee's many roles at Ofsted, he is also responsible for Ofsted's curriculum unit, which is why Lee's with us tonight, leading the work to publish subject research reports and associated inspector training. So after listening to me give very, very small introductions to these fantastic people with wealth of experience in the area, I'd like to hand over to them to talk more to you about what they're interested in relation to small schools. So Amy, I'd like to invite you to speak to our audience today about small schools.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's brilliant to be here. And actually, the first thing really to point out is how brilliant it is that this group of people are together in one virtual room and that we're having these conversations. So anybody who has anything to do with small schools or has sent their children to a small school or has worked in a small school or has a small school at the heart of their community knows what brilliant places they can be. And we've always known that, but it feels like it's taken a little bit of time to get everybody else talking about it in the way that they are now. So first of all, I think it's a great celebration that we have got the people here that we've got here who are all talking together about what small school life is like, and particularly what it's like to enact the curriculum in a small school. So when I was thinking about what I could bring to the table here in terms of the curriculum, I think probably everybody knows that my deepest kind of base for my knowledge comes from being a small school practitioner for so many years, and until January actually I was a teaching head of schools. I taught 4 days a week, and my class, which were obviously the best class in the world, were reception year 1 and year 2 altogether. And so our school was very small, and that's my experience of small schools, not just small schools in terms of half a form entry, but small schools in terms of multiple age classes. And if you think about that from a curriculum perspective, I think the first thing is for people who have never taught in a small school to really understand what that is like. So we know that with the curriculum in the current form that it is, that we need to have this kind of, we've got a huge national curriculum, all 11 subjects, 12 if you include MFL. They all have a lot of content that needs to be covered. We now need to develop that into a sequential, knowledge-rich kind of sequence that we're building up over time. We need to drive it forward continuously with brilliant subject leaders who are advocates for their subject. And there are lots and lots of challenges to that in all schools. But if you think about what that looks like from a teacher or a leader, even in a small school, it's even more challenging. So if we have to teach all 11 subjects, that's tricky enough in a primary curriculum. But if you have to teach 3 year groups within your one class and your one teacher, that obviously has some particular challenges. And then if we think about sequencing the curriculum, well, it's difficult to sequence the curriculum when you've got 4, 5 and 6 year olds all together in your class, and how you're going to sequence that kind of progressive knowledge. So that becomes a challenge, and you can't buy a scheme to deal with that. So there's a challenge there. And then of course it has to be driven forward by subject leaders who in a small school perhaps might wear many hats. So if you're a standalone small school, you could be the subject lead for 4 or 5 or even more subjects. And it sounds like a bit of an impossible challenge, but the thing that's really important here is that there are ways around it. We're finding ways around it. We're having conversations about how we can make sure the curriculum in a small school is as good, if not even better, than what you could potentially have in a larger school. And as the system changes, I think now we've got time to think about what it is that we need to do to make sure we're not thinking about small schools as a deficit model, but we're actually thinking about small schools as our curriculum can be as good as anybody else's curriculum, but also we have all of the extras that we know that a school at the heart of their community really can have. So yeah, that's where I'm at. I mean, I'm interested to hear what everybody says tonight. I once wrote something on Twitter about small school teachers being superheroes. The response I got to that on Twitter was, you're just saying their workload is more than other people's. And maybe that's right, but maybe we need to think about that. And we need to, if we're going to be committed to these schools as we have to be, we have to think about the reality of the school when we're making policy decisions or we're defining what outstanding looks like. So that's it from me.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Amy. My research group at the university is called CAPE, and it wasn't because we're all superheroes in education. It's context, agency, place, and education, but it doesn't hurt to have a CAPE. Fantastic. Thank you. I'd like to invite Denise Bryant now to talk to us.
Thanks, Tanya.
Over to you, Denise.
Thank you. Well, how do I follow that, Amy? It's really good to be here this afternoon, this evening, sort of talking to everybody. I'm in a bit of a unique position, I feel, in terms of I've got the opportunity to work with many small school heads in Nottinghamshire, and at the moment we've got 63 schools that are defined as small, ranging from 150 pupils down to our smallest, which is 19 pupils. I think in terms of what I wanted to sort of talk about in my blog was around the effectiveness of a small school curriculum, which Amy's touched on some of those things. And I believe that there is a dynamic relationship between small schools and effective curriculums, and that they do face not only unique challenges when designing their curriculum, but also massive opportunities. Amy's touched on things around the challenges in terms of formulating the curriculum, and that includes the planning for mixed age classes, which requires teachers to plan lessons that not only accommodate different age groups and different needs, but it also needs to make sure that it's being taught in a cumulatively sequenced manner that children can build on and sort of learn from. And another challenge for some of the small school head teachers that I speak to is the fluctuating cohort sizes. So they kind of get their curriculum sorted one year, and then the next thing they're having to rejig things around and how they manage that. So because cohort sizes can vary significantly in small schools, making it a challenge for those leaders and schools to maintain a consistent teaching approach. And a further challenge that they face are the limited numbers of staff, who Amy referred to quite rightly as superheroes, because they are taking on multiple subjects, and particularly when it comes to doing the deep dives, sometimes they're having to not only take part in one or two areas, but also, because the school's small, they're having to teach, and how they're managing that through an inspection for them is something that we've been looking at and trying to kind of navigate together. So again, in terms of limiting staff numbers, one of the things that some of the small schools in Nottinghamshire have been trying to do is getting everybody to be actively involved and supporting each other in the curriculum planning and development, and in spotlighting subjects to focus in on. And another challenge, and I will move on to the positives, is providing adequate and relevant CPD for staff, so that they feel confident not only in leading those subjects, but also in teaching in a mixed year group class. But there are, I feel, remarkable opportunities to create highly effective curriculums in small schools. A significant advantage in a small school is that the teachers know their pupils exceptionally well, as they've often taught them for more than 1 year. And this deep understanding of individual pupils' needs and learning styles can be a really powerful tool in helping them shape an effective curriculum. I mean, teachers in small schools often possess deeper curriculum knowledge, as they could have been the ones to teach or develop certain curriculum planning or provision in previous year groups, and they have children for, in their classes in some schools for up to 4 years. So they're able to see that connection between 1 year and the next. And that presents a great opportunity to build upon prior learning and ensuring that the pupils leave with a rich, interconnected curriculum that they can draw from. Small schools, I think, can also capitalise on their size and make and implement changes really quickly. If you haven't got many people on the staff, you can decide things and get that done quite quickly and quite efficiently. And they're used to working very collaboratively as well, and putting that effort in to innovate that curriculum development and to ensure that the curriculum remains adaptive to the changing needs of the pupils because they're having to respond, you know, on an annual basis. I think it's important for small schools, and I think a challenge as well as an opportunity is to develop a progression model that can suit the class structure and consider the concepts maybe that run throughout curriculum areas, so that there's a chance for the children to deepen that learning. And I think it's finding that balance within the small school between that disciplinary and the substantive aspects that some of my small school head teachers have been looking at and considering, particularly for those mixed year group classes, and ways in which they can foster pupils' understanding. So, you know, whilst they do face challenges in designing effective curriculums, I think they also possess advantages which can help them to inform and shape a curriculum that promotes the long-term learning for pupils. And I think they can create a curriculum that's not only effective but also unique to their own context, but it's also getting others to understand what that looks like. And we often talk about, you know, it's important to set the context within your small school to anybody who visits, because it's not one size fits all, particularly with the curriculum for small schools, because each school is unique in its own makeup and curriculum development, and that can be tailored to meet the needs of the school and the community and the pupils within it. And I think small schools need to be encouraged, and I think in some way when policies being made, to be flexible and adaptable in their approach to the curriculum and use their uniqueness to their advantage whilst aligning things to the national curriculum. So that's kind of where I sort of sit, from taking the knowledge from all of my fantastic small school heads in Nottinghamshire.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Denise. And I know that I've been writing down lots of notes while you've been talking, both of you, Amy and Denise. What a wealth of experience of actually being with and working with small school leads. Thank you. So we're going to move to our academics now. So I'd like to invite Dr. Kath Christie to say a few words.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for the invitation to join the panel. It's really good to be here. So I'm thinking about the contribution that I'm going to make this afternoon. And what I thought I'd do is just a quick whip round how I see the research landscape at the moment. There's actually very little current and recent research on small schools in England, very little indeed, and very little publicly available published work. So I've been looking at what's been published in the last 3 years or so. So the current research I'm aware of is focused around small school leadership, small schools and maths. These are just the numbers of people involved. As you can see, it's very, very small. There's somebody researching financing, and there are some projects around school closure. One of those is in Scotland. There seems to be a particular area of energy at the moment around researching mixed age teaching, with people looking to fund some important research in this area. It seems that this seems to be something that I can hear it already in what Amy and Denise have said. This a really important area to develop some research to support teachers and the education of new teachers. Okay, so I'm just going to try and get onto my next slide. I'll go back. So here's some recent publications. As I say, there's very little. The Church Times did a piece. Carl Bagley and Montse Fargus Mallet have got a really interesting project running but that's in Northern Ireland. Neil and I have done some work on a manifesto for small schools. The National Association of Head Teachers have written an article on financial squeeze. Tanya and Ian have done a fantastic chapter in looking around teacher recruitment. Amy and her colleague have done a lovely piece for the Chartered College, and you're probably aware of the data that was published in the Times Ed around primary school Ofsted outcomes, and also there's been a piece more recently in Schools Week. I'm very happy to provide anybody with this information should they find it useful at another time. But there's remarkably little, and so I've been drawing on research that's been published in other countries, in other places, and there's a wealth of material that I think could be very useful for people working here in the UK. There's a lot published in Australia, understandably, and obviously with a schooling system and curricula that's broadly similar, that research is very interesting. The US and Canada have a long history of small schools research. Interestingly, I've been speaking with people in Japan who've got similar demographic issues here in the UK, with sort of hollowing out of rural, peripheral, coastal places, and an aging population. In Europe, there's quite a lot of work going on in Spain. Again, it has broadly similar curricular and school organisation arrangements to England, so it's extremely useful, but maybe a sort of different political context. In Italy, there's been sustained work on small schools research by the government agency Indire, and they've been producing a lot of work. They started with a Small Schools Manifesto and are publishing a great deal. Sweden, Finland, Austria, again, there's some work being published here. They have a different, all those countries have different relationships between government, schools and communities. In Finland, for example, all schools, wherever they are considered a resource, a local resource. And so school changes like school closures, for example, have to be fully consulted as part of neighbourhood plans and so on. So the relationship there with the schools and their communities is different than it is here in England, but some fantastic work being generated there. And then in the sort of former Eastern Bloc, places like Czechia, Serbia and Poland have seen very, very rapid changes in the numbers of schools, very high levels of closure, and the impact on communities is becoming very evident in the research being published there. Last year at a BERA workshop, a number of folk got together in order to set a sort of research agenda going forwards, and it's interesting to see that these cluster around teacher education, professional development, leadership, funding, use of technologies in with particularly isolated and peripheral places, the grouping and clustering of schools. Again, mixed age classes, this keeps coming up. It's clearly a priority for both, for many, in many different spaces. Connections with places and communities is something that has gone here on the agenda, and then patterns of closure. And just to finish off, I'd just like to acknowledge the work of the National Association of Small Schools, and together with that organisation, we've put together this, and many teachers and many school leaders and community leaders put together a manifesto for small schools, which you can access either through the NAS website or I can provide you with a copy. But I'll just go back to the research priorities. These are priorities that were set by people like those of us on the panel, people involved in small schools and schools in rural, peripheral, coastal areas. It was very interesting that there were issues around just the definition of rural, the definition of small, the complexities around when definitions aren't clear. That leads to difficulties in some of the publications that have been going on, for example. I just wanted to mention one project that was happening in the south of Ireland, and they're looking at pupil attainment and looking at differences in attainment in school and with school size. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Kath. We're at time now.
Yeah.
Lovely.
I'm done, yeah. Yeah, oops, I'm done. So I'm going to go back out and stop sharing. Okay.
Thank
very
you.
much.
And it is really important, isn't it, to raise that issue of, what is the definition of a small school? We've all struggled with it. And what is the definition of rurality? We have a DFE definition of rurality. And is rurality and small necessarily the same thing? Because there are small schools in other places too. And we have seen that there's been a conflation of rurality and small in some thinking. Lovely, thank you, Kath. Over to Morag. Let's see what the situation's like in Scotland.
Well, and I'm going to, hello everybody, delighted to see such a good attendance at this event. I'm going to start with the problem of definitions. But before that, just to connect with what Kath was talking about, you can see from Kath's list that there's been little published from research in small schools in Scotland. However, I think it's important to say that a large number of the areas identified on that list as interesting and important for research, teacher education, leadership in small schools, technology, clusters, groups of schools, connections with place, which is something I've worked on myself. All of these are important parts of ongoing work, if not part of current research projects. Certainly within my own institution in the University of Highlands and Islands, areas that are directly informing our practice, working with initial teachers for first qualifications, and also in school leadership. Education is a devolved issue in Scotland, so our policy decisions about education sit with the Scottish Government and local authorities. We still have, I don't have a percentage, but I think almost all of our schools, apart from in what we call independent schools, public school sector in England, are part of local authority provision and sit within that structure. In Scotland, there's no definition of a small school, but in recent work that I've been involved with in a research project on closure of small schools, we've been following a definition that was set by the first person to publish on small schools in Scotland in 2009, Dowling, where we're thinking that a primary school has at the most 125 pupils and a small secondary at the most 400. I think it's important to say that within the Scottish context, they're really quite high numbers of a roll for a small school. Our small schools have much lower rolls than that. I can see Anne Patterson nodding her head here. We've no definition of small schools, but in Scotland, really that sits within rural schools, and they are defined by the Scottish Government based on an urban-rural classification, as in distance from urban centres. But that's the policy situation we're in, and that's what we work with in Scotland. 50% of all schools in Scotland are located in what the government define as rural or remote areas. I have some figures from 2018 where 37% of our primary schools, mostly in rural areas, and I do appreciate that there are often small schools on the edges of urban conurbations, but mostly in rural areas, had 125 pupils or less, and 15% of our secondary schools had 400 pupils or less. And these really vary. My own university, we're a federated institution, and we work from Argyllshire, so just immediately north of Glasgow, all up the west coast of Scotland, round towards Inverness. I perhaps should have had a map with me, and include all the inhabited Scottish islands. And in that area, we have primary schools with pupils from our primary 1 to primary 7, perhaps a school like Loughdon and Ulva on the island of Mull with 8 pupils this year. Tiree High School, I don't have current figures, but usually has a roll of around 30 to 35. In our Northern Isles, we have junior high schools who take pupils to 16. This is unusual in Scotland. Normally pupils stay in one high school for all of their secondary education. And the school on Mid Yell this year has a roll of 43. So we really are talking about smaller numbers. Our current curriculum, Curriculum for Excellence, was introduced in 2004. And at the time was highly regarded, and still is perhaps highly regarded in some areas, but it's had a number of implementation issues since then. It rolled out and developed with the children who started school in that year. And it's very much, it's learner focused, learner centred, it's focused on skills development, as opposed to learning facts, which caused some issues when it reached the secondary schools for the first time. And the idea was it had a decluttered content and, importantly, a return to teacher autonomy in designing and implementing the curriculum. And that's something that has been of real strength in our small rural schools. It has 4 phases: early, first, middle, broad general education at the beginning of secondary education, and then a senior phase with the school exams as part of that.
Morag, just to say, just a few more seconds.
Oh dear me, right, okay, I'll need to be quick. It suits small schools because there's flexibility and there's an option for adaptation to meet local needs. And it's supported innovative curricula, particularly in our many very small single teacher schools, and the provision of secondary curriculum in schools with rolls below 200 and a limited number of subject specialists. That has been supported by an early adoption of digital provision across and between particularly secondary schools, and the likes of the eSchool, which is Gaelic focused but also supports all secondary subjects. It's based in the Western Isles. The curriculum itself doesn't acknowledge small or rural schools in particular, but it provides a framework for them to work from identified local needs and design curriculum in that way to be delivered to suit the community that the schools are located in. I'll stop there.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Morag. And what it demonstrates and why it was so important, I think, to have that Scottish flavour in here with small schools is that devolvement that allows autonomy within curriculum design. And we'll come back to that when we're looking at questioning. So thank you, Morag. I'd like to move over now to the Church of England and to Andy. Andy, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Tanya, and thanks so much for the other presenters. It's been such an interesting session so far. I'm going to just share a little bit about the Church of England's work in this space. And hopefully, if you can see my slides, I'm going to begin with an exciting moment of technology where you can use the QR code there to download a report that we've just published. It's called Our Hope for a Flourishing School System. And I'd really encourage you to point your device at the screen now, and that'll enable you to download this key Church of England document, which is seeking to reaffirm our vision for education in a landscape that is firstly quite fragmented, and the withdrawal of the Schools Bill means it will continue to be fragmented, and also a landscape that is subject to all manner of political pressures and changes, as we've even seen today, this afternoon. The Prime Minister has announced a fairly major reform to education thinking, and we know that that is likely to continue over the next 12 months as 2 or more parties continue to discuss what they think the education system should be for. So in that document, we talk a lot about small schools, because as you're probably aware, the Church of England runs a pretty large percentage of them, around 70% of small schools in England. And I really encourage you to take a look at that, because it lays out this vision for what it might mean to be flourishing, both at school level, well, actually beginning the flourishing of children, and really recognizing that in too many contexts, we see the kind of small schools setting as like a deficit model, like an inconvenient challenge for people who organise policy, when actually it should really be the most vibrant place of learning in all of the system, because at the heart of it is high quality engagement with local community, meeting need, the high quality relationships, and specific approaches to pedagogy, which we've been discussing already. So do take a look at that. I just wanted to just draw a couple of things out of it. The first is this quote, which I don't know if you will agree with this or not, but regardless of the nature of the structural partnership, so we're not particularly saying every small school must be in a MAT, and you know the comment in the chat actually around expertise around small schools in MATs is actually really well made. It's part of the reason why we have relaunched our Flourishing Trusts network, which is bringing together now over 50 MATs to collaborate on this kind of issue. But it's important that you can see that that every single school finding the right place within a flourishing family of schools in which it can thrive. You know, we don't particularly have a vision for small schools staying on their own. That doesn't seem a particularly, you know, when you imagine small school and rural education in the 2030s or 2040s, that doesn't seem a particularly wise way of thinking about it. But equally, we need to make sure that our trusts and our federations and those groups are, as you can see here, hospitable and well-resourced spaces for such schools, and you know, really well thought through in terms of leadership development, teacher development. I'm really encouraged to see that in the chat as well. I'll come on to that in a moment. But really making sure that we see how to really celebrate what can only be achieved in a small school, and that the appropriate levels and tailoring of leadership development and teacher development are there for those working in those contexts. In the document, we go on to make a range of recommendations, and if you read the whole document, you'll see that they're not all to do with small schools, but some of them are. So a couple of them there are around structural reform, so that, you know, we can't really see a way that you can complete that reform journey without a really coherent dialogue between school trusts and dioceses and other kind of system level leaders, for a sustainable strategy that makes sense to all stakeholders. If we do it in a piecemeal way, we'll kind of never kind of get there really. And you can see there those notions about being that focus on the long-term flourishing. And then lastly, just an example of something that we're doing practically in this space, which you may be interested in. We, as you know, are a national lead provider for the MPQs, but have developed a specific small schools version of the MPQs, which firstly tailors the leadership content towards small school leadership. So the exemplification and the case studies and the knowledge application is all around leading in a small school context, which clearly is completely different to leading in a bigger primary school or even a bigger secondary school. And then the second thing is that the delivery model has been designed by small school leaders for small school leaders. So it's practically much more achievable, because we know that the challenges of coming out of school are disproportionately difficult for smaller schools, getting people out. So on a very practical level, all of that content is chunked up into small pieces, and we run it in two different groups. There's an after school group that you can join, you know, if you want to minimize school cover arrangements, but there's also an afternoon group which a similar number of people are involved in, And that's designed so that we're not simply saying, well, small school leaders must do everything after school, because that's an easy trap to fall into, that you end up having to do everything. I mean, ironically, we're doing this in the evening, I know, but you know what I mean. So if you'd be interested in that, there's 500 or so people on that program at the moment as a fully national cohort. And if you take that journey on any of the MPQs, you and your staff would be learning with leaders from other small schools across the country. And one of the key parts of that is to build this sense of network and collaboration and sharing best practice, that kind of small but mighty kind of approach. Because actually, when you tot up the number of small schools, it's actually a really large number, but may not always feel like that. So hopefully that's some interesting, useful stuff in there for you to dive into. Just for total clarity, these programs and this thinking is not only for Church of England schools. So if you're from a Church of England school, you might particularly resonate with it, I suppose, but we're increasingly finding this language really resonating with the wider sector. In fact, I'm speaking at the CST conference tomorrow morning about this exact thing for the wider sector. So I'll hand back to Tanya. Hopefully that's helpful stimulus. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And it's been really interesting to see the different perspectives that we've had from our panels so far. So we've had challenges, we've had advantages of small schools, and now we've got solutions to supporting through networking small schools as well. I'd like to move on to Ofsted now. We're going to start with Mike Sheridan. So hi, Mike, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Tanya, and thanks all for being here today. I'm Mike Sheridan. I'm one of Ofsted's regional directors, as Tanya said before, and I've been in a HMI for 14 years now. It seems like only a minute ago since I was in the classroom, and that's where my DNA is. Before I joined the inspectorate, I was the head of small schools in the Federation. My smallest school had 28 pupils, and in preparation for this today, I've been looking at old photos. There's my old class, which was the whole school. And for those who don't believe I was in the classroom, and Lee, if you tell anybody about this picture, I'll never speak to you again. But that was me there teaching them. And I'm sure you'll all agree, I haven't changed a bit in the 20 years since that was taken. Listen, I understand small schools. I think I've worked in very isolated communities in Cumbria teaching, and I understand the huge difference that they make in their community. And it was interesting listening, particularly at the beginning there, to Denise and Tanya, to the enormous challenges that exist. I recognise that. I recognise the difficulties of leadership. When Andy said about not doing things in the evening, I remember those days where you'd start your emails at 4:30 when everybody had gone, and you'd get through them, and then you'd pick up your marking after that. It's tough. It's a really tough gig, but it makes a huge difference within education and beyond in the communities in which we serve. And I want you to know that thinking is there at the centre of Ofsted. I sit on the executive board, and I will make that point regularly when we're talking about things, as if every school's got 300 children. It particularly resonated that the challenges of teaching and the challenges of trying to set the direction for what exists for teachers, the curriculum and that long-term plan when you've got different sized cohorts. Again, I remember, one year we had 8 children in, which was huge. The next year we had none, and then we had 2, and it goes on, and you're constantly trying to reshuffle the deck chairs to make that work. But we all know the value that small schools create, and we all know the important place they have in our communities and indeed in our culture. I think that we've designed an inspection framework here that is flexible enough to recognise that, but at the centre of it's inspection work, the substance of education. And I think there are challenges that are particular to small schools in that. But I think it'd be really hard to find anybody who works in a small school that wouldn't say that the young people that they serve deserve the skills and the knowledge that they need to move on to the next stage of their education. And it's been really interesting listening to the comments today, particularly listening to Andy and some of the stuff from the Church of England about how we're starting to develop those solutions from the ground up, how we're starting to think about what is working, and how we're starting to think about how we might reorganise the way we think about leadership in small schools without breaking the model, which we know is incredibly valuable to those who we serve. I've inspected loads of small schools in my time, and I've seen some great ones, but I've also seen some pretty poor ones as well. And I think we've got to acknowledge that not everybody does this in a really good way, that sometimes small schools do let down young people. They don't leave with the skills that they're capable of and the knowledge that they need to do well in the next stage of their education. And we need to make sure the right solutions are there to support those schools in being as good as they can be. I'm not going to talk for too much longer because I think we're probably sort of over time already, Tanya, but the thing I do want to finish with is that, you know, it's not Ofsted's job to tell people what to do, but I think we have got a role to play in helping you understand what we're seeing that is working in small schools, and we plan to do some work over the coming months. Amy will know about this from the conversations we've had, and this has been very much provoked from that group that we have meeting to talk about small schools. We're going to go in and look at the schools that are coming out as good and outstanding through this framework, and really understand not just what they're doing in terms of how they've organised the curriculum, but how they're creating the capacity for that, how they're making sure they're getting the resource in the right place, and how they're building in the flexibilities that are necessary for that to work in our smallest schools. The final thing that I want to say is, we talked before about definitions of orality and small schools, and I think we've almost got to have some subcategories there. You know, I've led a school with 150 children, and it's very different to leading a school with 25 children. And I think we need to have one conversation about what the quality of education should be and what those standards should be for the young people who we're all serving. But I don't think we should be under the illusion that there is one size that fits all, because those schools are usually different, and the challenges that those young people, those schools face are as different as the sizes of the schools, and that goes down to staffing. It goes down to the responsibility we're giving to our youngest members of staff. I live with an ECT. My daughter's just graduated and is teaching year 1. She's got no subject responsibilities at all. She's doing a brilliant job. She's settled right into the role, and she's coming home exhausted every night. I can't imagine what it would be like for doing 3 or 4 year groups with no partner teacher to bash ideas around with, and to have 2 or 3 subject areas to lead. I just think we've got to think about how we look after our young teachers in that environment and make sure that they're there in 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years time and become the head teachers of our next generation in small schools as well. So that's me. I think Lee's probably going to talk more about the EAF, but I'll stop speaking now, Tanya, before you tell me to stop.
You were a minute under time, Mike, so thank you.
Wow. That's the first time ever.
And it's really interesting because there was a question very early on in the chat, and colleagues, please do put your questions for the panel into the chat at any point in time, and I'll go back through those when we get to that in today's agenda. But yeah, there was a question in there, Mike, around early career teachers and the impact on them of working in a small school. I suppose from the converse of that, you know, the impact on the small school of having an ECT when they have the ECF to undertake. So yeah. Really good point that you made there at the end. Thank you. And now we go finally, but not leastly, to Lee Alston. So over to you, Lee.
I see what you did there. Good. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Good to be here. And actually, thank you for the privilege of having 2 Ofsted voices. And I'll try not to duplicate what Mike has already said, although build on it. And obviously, my role, as you heard Tanya say at the beginning, is responsibility for the education inspection framework, and also our curriculum unit, which is where a lot of our research and practice reports are coming from. And hopefully lots of you will be aware of those in terms of, as Mike said, not telling, not prescribing how, you know, every individual school should go about their curriculum work, but certainly using the insight that we have to share what we see is working particularly well. But as we all know, best practice in one school might not necessarily be best practice in another, because context does play and is key. 2 things, because I realise often the beauty of having Ofsted along at an event is the kind of question and answers that can come afterwards. But just a few things that I want to do. My usual reassurances, because I know lots of people seek advice and information about Ofsted, not from Ofsted. So I do just want to make sure that, you know, we can clarify a few messages and reassure you along the way, and then just give you a little bit of a sense of where we might be going next, as Mike alluded to, in terms of some of our work, particularly around small schools, but curriculum generally. So just to say, obviously, the education inspection framework is a framework that we have developed from the evidence, from the research, that actually is a framework for all children in all schools, because I'm sure we would all agree that we can't have different national expectations depending on where you live, which school you attend, and then even the type of school or the structure of school. However, that doesn't mean that when we inspect schools that are different in shape, size, and form, that the context isn't important in terms of the pragmatics of how we physically carry out that inspection, recognizing that there aren't as many people to talk to, or people wearing multiple hats in a small school compared to others, but equally that there will be different challenges. And I want to come on to one of those, which is curriculum sequencing, in a moment. But 3 kind of main reassurances from me. First, that we don't expect to see any particular approach to planning or implementation of the curriculum. Essentially, it's up to you to kind of tell us why it is you do what you do. Secondly, the inspection or our discussions with subject leaders are not a test of subject knowledge, because we know, particularly in a small school, not everybody will be a subject expert in the hat or the subject hat that they are wearing. Essentially, again, it's a conversation about, just let us know, tell us about why you've decided to do things in the way that you have, and whether it's making the difference that you intended. And thirdly, which kind of links them all together, we don't expect people to develop their entire curriculum from scratch. It is perfectly reasonable in subjects where you may not have subject expertise in your school to buy a scheme, to work with another school, to pool resource. So again, there is no expectation about having to have a geography expert in your school, because we're certainly not going to be quizzing them about their geography knowledge, only what they are doing with the geography curriculum and teaching in the school that we're inspecting. So they're broad reassurances, if you like. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not aware of the challenges around designing a curriculum in a small school. And I want to come to a kind of general principle, which my team are kind of crafting at the moment is sequencing all that there is? Because you can be forgiven for thinking that when we talk about curriculum, the first thing everybody thinks about or turns to is it sequenced? And inspectors will ask those questions, and schools are asking those questions. But essentially, there's a lot more to curriculum thinking than just the sequencing of topics. And if you haven't looked at it already, it was published way back in 2019, but it's still relevant. We obviously have a document called Inspecting the Curriculum, which out of the 17 principles from research that we've pulled together, sequencing is only one of those. And there are 16 other elements to curriculum that I think deserve just as much time and attention. Things you'll know about small bite-sized chunks, not overloading working memory, the importance of addressing misconceptions, that ability to kind of question and receive feedback. And I think rightly at the beginning of any framework, and of course this framework has developed across quite unprecedented times, a pandemic, and then moving beyond that. So we haven't had the momentum with it that we would have liked, although we're getting there. I think it's important that while we all start by thinking about curriculum intent, what is it that I want children to learn? Actually, the ultimate test is the impact that it has on pupils. And ultimately, that is what we will be focused on. No matter how you've sequenced your curriculum, what you've decided to teach or not teach, that ultimately is the test. So what difference is it making for the children in your school, in the communities that you serve? And while it's not my place or my team's place to say, and this is how you should do it, I think one of the ways that we will certainly roll out to inspectors in January, and we'll certainly think about ways of sharing that with the sector, whether that's webinars or blogs, is thinking less about covering every element of the national curriculum, because having been a primary school teacher myself, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of wanting to do absolutely everything within that document. but really making decisions within that broad framework that is the national curriculum about what it is you want to use as the context in which to teach some of those broad concepts and themes. So perhaps not choosing, for example, to teach your history curriculum in a chronological order, because that's not possible in a small school with mixed age classes, but thinking about those broad themes that the national curriculum will not tell you, but using those periods of time as the context in which to develop those. So I'm thinking about how we develop concepts of power, or how we've come to kind of vote in the way that we do. And that could be done through ancient Rome, ancient Greece, any period of history that you want. So I think we are aware of the challenges, and there's plenty of work in the pipeline that hopefully in kind of months to come we'll be able to either come back or share with you in other means. But of course, the reassurance is that at the end of the day, it's the difference that we're all making in these particularly small schools. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get at through the conversations that we have.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Lee. Really interesting insights there into the way in which the education inspection framework, although standardised for all schools, as Lee said, to ensure quality is perceived in the same way. Was that a correct interpretation, Lee?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, disappeared from my screen, then came back. I wonder, so I'm going to ask a few questions of the panel myself before going over to our audience, and I'm collecting questions from the chat at the moment, so please do keep adding those in. My first one I'm actually going to address to Amy, Denise and Andy. So given the position that Mike and Lee have established for Ofsted in relation to the way in which small schools are supported by Ofsted during inspections, do you think those broad reassurances about contextualisation by HMI, and I did notice a question pop up in the chat about it takes a very experienced inspector who understands small schools like Mike to be able to nuance an understanding of what's going on in there in relation to subject specialism and way in which curriculum has been interpreted. Do you think those broad reassurances are enough? Are you reassured?
Should I go? Yep.
Absolutely.
So I think in some respects, yes, because we have, it's been a bit of a process working through the very beginning of the education inspection framework. And when it was very, very first introduced, somebody very senior in Ofsted said to me, Amy, it could be your small school size that makes your curriculum not good enough. I think we've moved on from that. And we're in a different place, and Ofsted now are understanding much more what small schools are like and the challenges that we face, or that they face in terms of the curriculum. I think in terms of Lee's comment about sequencing, is it all about sequencing? We all know it's not just all about sequencing, but the reason we're all talking about sequencing is because so many Ofsted reports have said it's about sequencing. So we do, Ofsted, we've had an inspection recently, and Ofsted have said, the lead inspector said, Ofsted set the direction, and they do set the direction. So, we've just had the brilliant geography report. Brilliant. This is what's happening in great geography curricula across the country. There are now people who are trying to make that happen in their school because they want to get it right and they want to do the right thing. So I think some assurances, yes, it's great that we're looking at different things and we're having these conversations. That's fab. Some things to work on for sure, and it comes back to this idea of making sure that we're not just accepting a deficit model for the curriculum in a small school, and that's got to be really important. So if we are really genuinely saying this education inspection framework is inspecting what we currently believe to be the best curriculum we can give to our children, we have to find a way to make it work, but we have to be realistic about that. And we've got to stop saying we can buy a scheme. We can, but whose scheme covers reception year 1, 2 and 3? We've got to be really careful with that because it doesn't. Nobody does that. So yes, to some extent, I think we're on the journey.
Thanks, Amy. Andy, Denise, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'd love to come in on that. I mean, I found that really helpful and really reassuring. Of course, like right across the whole country, there will whatever an inspection framework says, there will be interpretations of that individual schools don't necessarily agree with their lived experience. You know, we find that the same in our Section 48 inspections as well. I think that's sort of an inevitability of any system, but we do think that the current framework gives a lot of space and opportunity for inspection around what is going to suit the needs of the actual community, and obviously that needs inspectors to be in listening mode and genuinely seeking to understand the needs of that community. But the framework and its implementation does give the potential for that, and it's good to see in the chat people sharing comments about that. I mean, I think it does also point though towards, if we are to sort of want to do all the things we would want for children to flourish in a smaller school, that does make different demands on teacher development and leadership development, because just a very basic level, if you are the subject leader for minimum 5 subjects, at none of which you have any post A level experience in, it is clearly different leading that subject compared to if you're the head of music who's got a music degree in a secondary school. I mean, it's clearly completely different. So unless we have a sensible way of resourcing and training teachers and leaders to really flourish in those roles, then I think the leaders that I would speak to regularly would always feel like they're playing catch up with all of that, and they're trying to somehow spin the plates with which is a difficult task, and then probably brings a level of anxiety when you are the deep dive for geography and you're feeling a bit out of your depth, and that requires a different kind of leadership to lead out of into a subject where you don't have that own personal background. But that's why we're trying to do what we're doing around subject leadership in particular. So yeah.
Denise, is it a similar experience for you working with your school leads?
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of the things you've said there, and I completely agree. I think there is some reassurance, particularly around the schemes, because we had so many small school heads trying to write their own curriculum for every subject. And if you're a teaching head and you're a standalone LA maintained school, and you've only got say an NQT or an ECT +1, that's a lot of pressure to be put under to try and get that, which is why we've been sort of saying some spotlight subjects, try and find the ones that are your strength. And I know we found last year there was a reluctance to look at schemes and think about how they could be adapted, whereas now to hear that coming through, that they won't be not penalised, but they won't be frowned upon if they wanted to use a scheme to try and supplement what they're teaching. I think some small school heads will be reassured by that. But yeah, exactly what Amy and Andy says. I think there is still variability in the inspectors going into schools, and I think the more training they can have around what it can look like and what they should be considering, and not expecting it to be the same as a single form entry primary school or a secondary school or whatever else, making sure that they take that context and they actually really actively listen to what those school leaders are saying is absolutely crucial. So there's some things there that are reassuring, and I think we're in the right direction, but I feel we've still got a bit of a way to go.
Thank you, Denise. And it's interesting, actually, linking all of that, because I'm going to come back to Mike and Lee so that they can respond to our other panelists' points of view there. Andrew Beasley said in the chat, great to hear reassurances, but only last week, one of my small settings was heavily criticised because subject leads with 3 subjects each were deemed not to have sufficient subject knowledge. So, Lee, you were saying that the inspection is not testing subject knowledge, it's testing leadership of a subject area. So taking all of that into account and what our panelists have said, how would you respond?
Yeah, I take the comments there in the chat. I've been reading them, and I think it's trying to get underneath what do we mean by kind of as that message said, insufficient subject knowledge. I mean, how is that demonstrated itself on inspection, and what it's difficult on inspection to boil everything you see down into a report and essentially what you might then give in feedback. Was that because teachers, and I don't know, and on a session like this I can't necessarily get into the specific details of one inspection. Is that because pupils' queries or misconceptions weren't picked up? Is that because the content hadn't been selected in the first place? So there's a whole host of reasons, but I do understand the complexity of them boiling all of that down, as inspectors do, to then what we would say, what is the systemic issue that's preventing this school from being even better? And I think that can come across as being about subject knowledge. I suppose what I was reassuring people in my kind of 5 minutes was that it's not a quiz of a subject leader about what they know. It's how well as a leader they can articulate what they're doing with their subject. But I don't know if Mike wants to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Lee, and thanks, Tanya. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I thought that one. I saw the comment come up from Andrew there, and I thought, yeah, it's always a challenge that, because we write in shorthand in reports of the parents, and I think the comments that are made on inspections sometimes can be taken in isolation rather than in the context of the wider conversation. Subject knowledge is important overall, but nobody in a primary school can be an expert in everything. I think the question is often about, how are we creating the knowledge bank for people to know what they need to know to be able to teach or to be able to lead. But I'm really reassured by some of the conversations we've been having here about leadership development, about how we can start to overcome this challenge about the financial pressures versus MATs or small schools joining MATs where all the schools are large. How the answers are all in this room. What we need is a community of people who can start to think about, well, how do we start when you've got 3 teachers in 20 schools to spread that subject leadership around? How can it be that we know at least one person we can pick up the phone to anytime to talk about history is going to know that stuff. Now, there's a perfection to that, and we've always got to be careful not to make perfection the enemy of good in these scenarios. But when I was ahead, we became a federation for this very reason. We talked about being a school with roads instead of corridors, because we wanted to make sure we'd got enough people to take the load, and we did it imperfectly. Everything wasn't great in terms of our curriculum development, far from it. But we'd spread the load, and we had an English specialist, we had a maths specialist on, who worked in different schools. And I think you will get comments like that. The question I think for leaders is, so how are you overcoming that deficit in knowledge in the school? If we don't know enough about music, and it's always music, or music often comes up as a subject that people struggle with, how are you getting that expertise? Are you using the hub? Are you using a scheme, understanding all of the limitations that Amy talked about before, but it has a lot of content in there that you can start to use as a reference point? How are we starting to pull on expertise from elsewhere to make sure that the young people who are sat in front of you aren't getting a poorer deal because you haven't got that subject knowledge in your school? And that's the great conundrum, I think, for small schools. That taking the great advantage of knowing your children really, really well, but also making sure you're bringing to them all the stuff that they need to know to be able to do well, largely when they're going on to secondary school, or in small secondary schools when they're going on to study A levels or in FE.
So I'm going to bring Morag and Kath in now and ask them whether they've seen any solutions to some of these challenges in any of the work that they've been doing, either nationally in the 4 nations of the UK, but also in Europe or internationally. So is there any evidence or any work that you've been involved with that could help Ofsted in supporting schools in understanding how to do this?
Shall I go first, Maura?
Yes, please, Kat.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Yes, as I said, there's very little research being done in the UK, and we probably know reasons for that. But problems with accessing resources for research is one of those challenges. But looking into other places, I see first of all a lot of research from other countries that shows there's such the importance of schools for sustainable communities. And I think it's not a solution to some of the troubles that we have right now, but it's that kind of bigger picture. There is so much evidence that stresses the importance of schools for sustainable living, sustainable lives. And as we are living through a climate crisis and we have much more to come, the importance of schools to localities and to physical communities, really stressed in international literature. The importance of preparing teachers who are flexible, creative and innovative. That seems to be, again, really important teacher education, preparing teachers who can deal with so many different things. And that's perhaps a little bit different to some of the way that teachers are being educated, particularly in England. But that, again, very strong in the literature. And finally, something perhaps a bit more uplifting to think about is I was reminded by lovely Anne Patterson, thank you, Anne, of the total joy and joyfulness of a nature of working in small schools and mixed age teaching particularly. And again, that comes through the international literature. You don't tend to find it in what I'm seeing in the UK, but that I would encourage people to look beyond the UK, because there's some great stuff being written.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kath. Morag, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to add to that international literature has directly informed a lot of the practices we have in the provision of programmes, particularly within my own institution, because we have a digital delivery structure and have always done so, linked with some local provision. But in our teacher education programmes, we're looking to prepare teachers to go and teach in multi class situations, what we call composite classes, and to have the understanding and knowledge of the curriculum to be able to work with it. And we're doing a lot through leadership. There's a particular focus in Scotland on leadership qualifications and the development of school leaders, and a lot of that work is again through digital connections, is about building networks and sharing experiences and maintaining contacts, so that across a very broad geographic area, people teaching and leading small schools in particular, but also in our ITE, people teaching who then teach in small schools, have connections. And some of that is supported by our regional infrastructure in Scotland and the way school and curriculum development is led nationally. So we lack research, but we are beginning to develop it, and I think that's really important.
Thank you, both of you. And there was a question from Lisa Pettifer in the chat where she said, wasn't there a plan with Chartered College of Teaching a few years ago to look at training in small schools? It wasn't actually small schools, it was rural schools. And we talked about that, didn't we, at the beginning, sort of conflating definitions. But because so many small schools are rural, there was a nuance within it, but it was Chartered College of Teaching, Church of England, wasn't it, Andy, and also Teach First, and it was the Rural Teaching Partnership. But the issue with small schools taking on trainees to work with them, and with the reduction in workload as well, there was some issues. I know in Cornwall, because I was supporting our diocese with the rollout there was some capacity issues with the schools actually having a trainee in the first place. So I think there is a wider infrastructural challenge that our small schools have, that schools, because of their place, can't change. But actually the government is aware of this. We've seen the rural economy report from the House of Lords and the Seaside Town Regeneration report also from the House of Lords, recognising these infrastructural challenges. So small school leaders do what they can with what they have. And I think in terms of curriculum, we're hearing that actually those demands are quite vast, aren't they, really, in order to provide the quality of experiences and opportunities for their children that they want to. I'm going to move us to questions from our audience now. And I'm going right back to the beginning because I know there were a few questions in there very early on. And Andy, you were kindly answering some of those in the chat from Philip. But one of them was interesting. Well, all of them were interesting, but one that jumped out at me was in relation to multi-academy trusts and the position of small schools because of government policy around multi-academy trusts and the way in which that either puts them at risks or actually supports them, depending on the type of multi-academy trust that we have. I work with a number of MATs. I'm going to start saying it like that now because it's easier. And those MATs embrace their small schools as part of their contribution to their communities that they work with. And it's interesting, isn't it, that those MATs that I've worked with and those MATs that I've researched have actually created networks for small schools within their MATs so that their small school heads are recognised as having a nuanced and different experience to the much larger schools within that MAT. But it's actually very particular to the MAT. It's not a government policy. And therefore, it's not a prerequisite that all MATs do this. I just wonder your feelings on this, because we've already said we've got a very diverse, and I think the word used was fragmented, education system within England. And Scotland has devolved and has more opportunities for bringing things together, as we've heard from Morag. I'd like your comments on the position of small schools because of our fragmented education policy and practice now.
Well, I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think the schools bill provided a roadmap towards a fully academised system. Now that that's withdrawn, that will only really happen with hearts and minds thinking it's a good idea. And if we believe that isolated small schools are probably not a very sustainably good idea for the 2030s and 2040s, which I think it'd be difficult to dispute that, then there needs to be a coordinated regional approach to that. And obviously the DfE are keen on that, but it does require coordinated and ecology of trusts in that area to work wisely together to make that a possibility. If it's only done on a school by school basis, then due diligence processes will continue to throw up, challenges of a smaller school and its, long-term financial sustainability or current deficit budget or current building problem or whatever. And there are a number of things that can be done, obviously, nationally to kind of help grease the wheels of that. For example, even the costs of conversion are not insignificant, but they're disproportionately expensive in a smaller school, aren't they? They take up a bigger part of the budget. So it does need that regional approach. If we're not simply to recreate competition at a MAT level that we already have at a school level, we're in danger of just recreating a comparative thing at a different level. So that does need that join-up approach. And it also does need, colleagues will, I'm sure, be aware on the call that the percentage academisation is really wildly different in different parts of the country. So, Tanya, where you're based in the southwest, it's quite different from if we're going to the Lake District, for example, in Cumbria. It's like really, really different. So the sort of completion of that structural reform in Cornwall is a relatively easy sort of, finishing the jigsaw puzzle, whereas, in other parts of the country, without overextending the metaphor, haven't done the edge pieces yet. So doing the big jigsaw is more complicated. But we have to do that together, else it will, we just become complicit in a fragmented system for the next generation, which I just don't think is I think that's just lacks vision. It lacks social justice. It lacks it, and also, I don't know if this is also okay to say, but I think that we haven't really touched on rural deprivation as a key issue. Like, there's a stereotype that small rural school is sort of idyllic, high socioeconomic background, privilege, all of that. Whereas actually many of our small rural schools are hidden in our normal deprivation measures, but actually experience some of the most challenging socioeconomic conditions in the country. And so we've got to take the sort of social justice aspect of that really seriously as well, if we believe in the flourishing of rural communities. But anyway, that's another speech.
No, it's a really relevant point, because actually if our small schools, predominantly primary in England, if our small schools have persistently disadvantaged children in rural areas, the evidence demonstrates very clearly that persistently disadvantaged children in rural schools do less well than persistently disadvantaged children in urban schools. So place does matter, locality matters. And so we do need to be aware of that and what's happening at the start of their education journey and following that through. Why should disadvantage lead to disparate outcomes? Other panel members, would you like to comment?
Go on, Mike.
Well, I'll be very, very quick. I thought that was an incredibly erudite explanation, considering you said I'll have a go, Andy. I thought that was covered many, many bases, and I found myself nodding away until you got into national policy, in which I should stay very quiet because I'm a civil servant. But I thought there was an awful lot of sense in that. I mean, what I would say, and I think the point you made about different things in different parts of the country is absolutely true, as is the point you made about deprivation. You just have to start linking a DACI index to some wards and rural wards in places like Norfolk, and you can see that come through really, really well. But we are seeing it again in places like Norfolk, trusts that are being set up that are very much focused on delivering small school experiences in small schools. I think for all of the infrastructure that's there with the DFE now in terms of regional directors, the groundswell from colleagues on this call and others to do that, to understand that you can do that and not lose your identity, to do that and to actually gain a level of autonomy and an ability to deliver on what you want to deliver is an incredibly important message for people to take away from this.
Thank you, Mike. Amy?
Yeah, I think I agree actually with both of what Mike and Andy said. And I think the key thing from a small school leader perspective is that they're definitely working better together. So somebody said to me, it was a CEO of a MAT said to me, he had small schools in his MAT, and he said to me, well, the thing about small schools is they're one member of staff away from requires improvement at all times. And that's probably true, because each member of staff has such a big responsibility, and they count for so much. They could be half of the teaching staff. And if you lose a member of staff and you lose their experience and their skills and all of that, it takes a long time to build that back up again, unless you're working within a network. And maybe MATs is the answer. Maybe, as somebody said, MATs aren't the only show in the town in the chat. Whatever it is, I do genuinely believe that small schools are better when they're working together, even if that's in an informal collaboration, like WhatsApp group or whatever. There's a national WhatsApp group that we have, and there are people on there every day saying, have you got this? I've got this challenge. Sometimes mid-inspection, what do I say here? And that's really, really valuable. So I feel like we are better together. I don't know what the structure for that is, but I would urge any small school leaders or teachers to reach out and contact other small schools, because there are people who understand.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. There's a question by Vicky in the chat that I think covers all of our panelists, actually, and it's probably going to be our final question for today before we do our kind of sum up. But if you haven't had your question answered, we will have the chat, and we will get back to you if we possibly can with an answer on that. But what Vicky said is, do schools in other parts of the world feel the need to adapt their curriculum implementation approach to satisfy the inspectorate like our schools do? Do Ofsted look at how other countries inspect small schools? And if so, what is being learnt from this? So it's a really interesting question, isn't it? What experience and evidence is there elsewhere that we can use to understand how we're going about inspecting our small schools in this country? Would anyone like to offer comment on that?
So I'll start off very quickly and I'll leave it to my policy colleague on the call. Well, we do talk to other inspectors all the time, but equally, please, you're not doing anything for Ofsted. Ofsted looking at the quality of education. I know that's a really easy thing for me to say from my ivory tower, but I think we have to frame these conversations about making sure that we're providing a really great education for the young people who we serve. I understand and appreciate it, but it worries me about how often the conversation moves away from what young people need to what Ofsted want, because actually I think they're one of the same thing. So I'll now hand over to Lee to give you the answer to your question, but I just wanted to put that caveat in there before we started.
Yeah, no pressure. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, and well, similar sentiment. And as those of you that know and have seen me at other events, my last slide is normally, do what you know is right for your children, not what you think is right for Ofsted. And I share that every opportunity that I can. We speak regularly with not only the cross-nation inspectorates, but also those from the continent and wider. Interestingly, they're often interested in what we're doing as a model. And although we have that knowledge exchange about and what are you doing in reverse to try and understand, where we each come from in perspective, it is, and work recently has more been about early years inspection as it has been about schools inspection, but other people do, because I think of the strength of the Ofsted brand. But I think that's a job for us, Mike and our colleagues, to ensure that although Ofsted is a strong brand over the kind of 30 plus years that it's been around, that we don't lose sight of why we're all doing what we do. And that's not to tick a box or to please somebody. That's because it's the right thing to do for the children in front of you. And I know that's hard, and we could spend a whole other session about what's the difference between inspection and the consequences of inspection that are obviously from the DFE. But yeah, we haven't done anything specific about small schools, but obviously it's something that we can certainly table as we progress our work towards January and the small schools reference group the next time we engage with the different inspectorates.
Okay, in which case, to end this really interesting session, could each of you sum up what you think effective curriculum means for a small school in a sentence? I'm going to start with Kath.
I might unmute myself. Effective curriculum is about everybody learning and where they're at. So that means flexibility. That's what I've learned.
Thank you, Kath. Morag?
I would follow that with using that flexibility to build individual learner pathways and that suit the individual and meet the variety of needs within the community the school is based in.
Brilliant, thank you, Morag. And I've really taken away the fact that your curriculum is much more autonomous than ours is in England, which I think really helps small schools. Amy?
This is a really difficult question, so I'm going to just twist it slightly. So instead of what is an effective curriculum, I'm going to think about designing an effective curriculum in small schools. And I think my big takeaway would be better together. So see what's out there, talk to other people, get together with other small school leaders, maybe join the MPQs with the Church of England, because you'll be with like-minded people. So certainly better together.
Brilliant, thank you. So Andy, how would you respond to that? What's an effective small school curriculum for you?
Okay, how about this? I think it's got to be broad enough for every child to flourish, but it's got to be deep enough for every child to excel. How about that?
I like it a lot. And Denise, I can see we've got them branded already.
Yeah. I just think what everybody else has said. No, I mean, everybody's covered it all, really. I suppose it's around, for me, an effective curriculum, taking it away from that, is around developing those teachers and those subject leaders in school so that they've got the sufficient knowledge to be able to kind of go out there and perform and do and put it, do it for the children. Really, it's meeting the needs of those children. I felt really pressured then with all of those fantastic answers at the beginning. What else can you say?
It's true, and that was a fantastic answer too. Thank you, Denise. Mike, what's your take on an effective curriculum in small schools?
So first of all, I'm really disappointed you've asked all these people with really profound ideas to go before me. But let me have a go. So I think it's to read and to know what they need to know to understand, appreciate, and take part in the world around them.
Lovely. Thank you, Mike. And last, from Lee.
Come on, tell us what the answer is, Lee.
Yeah, very, very similar. So I've just been scribbling. So an effective curriculum is one that teaches what the children in front of you need to know or be able to do, so that it ignites their interest and curiosity, so they can be successful in their next stage of education and in life.
Lovely.
That's going to be in every school perspective up and down the country now, Lee.
It is. It'll be watched and watched again. Panel members, thank you so much for your time this evening, and audience members, thank you so much for your engagement with the chat and for your questions. We really appreciate it. We hope that this has been a useful discussion for you and understanding small schools and their challenges, but also their advantages in relation to curriculum. I came away thinking, oh, actually, there's 3 S's of challenges: subject, range, and leadership, staff development opportunities, and, sorry, Mike and Lee, sequencing. So it feels like there's 3 S's of challenges that we've kind of highlighted this evening, but actually the advantages of small schools and their opportunities with curriculum are really evident as well. As Amy said right at the beginning, there are opportunities to write the best curriculum for that school that you could have because of context and range there. So yeah, challenges but advantages, evidence but not necessarily from our country at the moment. If the SRC are watching this, then please do give more opportunity for funds in this area. We would like to research more and deeper. And we thank you all for your time, and we look forward to meeting you again. Take care.